the net result of getting this phone call from Washington said go to AFTAC, put me down there in Orlando. There was no rush behind it. I don't remember what day I went there, but I was told to take my wife and one child with me, which I did do. And we got in Orlando on time, found a place to live, etc. Now, as this settling got into things, this General Seville that I reported to, very fine gentleman, and I went to him one morning. I didn't have anything to do with it. I'd done everything I needed to get settled. So I went in and told the general I wanted to go to work. And he looked at me and he said, what do you want to do? I said, sir, whatever you tell me to do. He looked at me, he said, I can't tell you what to do because I don't know what I'm supposed to do. He and his secretary and Bob Scott, who wrote God Is My Co-Pilot, were playing hearts every morning. And he asked me if I knew how to play hearts. I said no. He said, well, sit down, you're going to learn. And so I got in there for a couple of those sessions. But then they did get a B-17 in there that had been loaded down with guns all over the damn place. They wanted me to fly it and evaluate it. And the net answer, in my opinion, when I got through after about fiddling around with it 5 or 6 days, it just didn't go anywhere. It couldn't climb. It was so weighted down. I had so much armament on it, it couldn't carry any weapons or even defend itself properly. And that one was given up as a bad effort. But I got word in a sequence of time. I got word to go to Wichita and be prepared to get to meet General K.B. Wolf at the factory. He was from Wright Field, an expert on engines, airplanes, and so on. I did as directed. I went to Wichita. First, I took my wife and kids who were with me in Orlando. Her parents' home was in Columbus, Georgia. So I took her and the kid to Columbus, Georgia, left them and went on out to Wichita. And with that, I'm standing in the flight test hangar when the time came for all the men to get there, and they came in waiting, and General Wolf appears, and he knows everybody there by first name. And he says, go look at this, go look at something else. And after he did that to about 10 or 12 different people, he looked at me, he said, what you supposed to do? I said, sir, I was sent here to fly airplanes. He looked out the window, you could see him. There were 5 of them parked side by side out there, were called YB, service test models. And he said, there's 5 airplanes out there, go pick one and fly it. Yes, sir. Well, that's a good order, but I didn't let that stop me. I started talking to a couple of factory guys there. I said, you got anybody here knows how to open that thing up and even start an engine? They said, well, we got one man, I probably could do it. He's ridden with Eddie Allen 4 or 5 times. I said, good. They brought this young man in, and he was from the engineering department. And I said, you know how to get in the airplane? He said, oh, that's real simple. I said, can you start the engines? He said, I think so. He said, I never was an engineer, but I watched enough. When Eddie Allen was flying, I watched his engineer. And I said, well, if you can get the engine started, we're going to go fly this airplane. And he said, fine. I got 2 men to ride the back of scanners. One of them, this engineer taught him how to start the auxiliary power plant so we'd have electricity. I needed a co-pilot. And I looked around, and here comes a nice look. I'm a lieutenant colonel at this time. Here comes a nice looking major. And I got him, I said, he was wearing wings. I said, come on, you're going to go with me. We're going to go out that B-29. And they said, okay, so we went out there. And this engineer, I stuck my head up in there, and I said, how's things going? He says, fine. He said, I'm ready to start engines. I said, good. So I told the co-pilot, I said, you climb in this thing, we're going to go fly it. He said, I've never been in one. I don't know how to fly it. I said, doesn't make a difference. I haven't been in one either, but we're going to fly this airplane. And with that, now, not trying to be funny, but I knew damn well if it flew like an airplane, I could fly it. The question is, you know, what's its characteristics? And that's what I wanted to learn. I made myself clear. I said, we're going to start the engines, and an engineer was listening to me. It's the 2 guys to back there. We're going to start the engines. We're going to taxi out we're going to get on the end of the runway, and I'm going to run it down to where I considered I got some aileron control. I want to see how the ailerons, the rudder, and everything acts when I'm doing that. We'd have to turn around and go back now because the engines would heat up so rapidly because they were too tight, too much of an enclosure with the cowling around them. We can't fly them without the cowling. You need it, but that was what the engines got heated up. It took me 3 hours to get the airplane off of the ground by testing what I wanted to do. I had to test the brakes. How well can I stop it if I need to stop it? What is the aileron control? Is this ready to lift? Because every time we'd do that, we'd go back, we'd have to wait 20 to 30 minutes for the engines to cool down a little bit. And but I think it was the 5th time that I got on the runway, started down to go, that I got it off at the end of the runway. When I did, it was another airplane, flew just like one, and by the same token, we could get the engines cooled down, and I don't know, I must have fallen for a couple of hours playing with it. How does it climb? How does it descend? How does it act when it bring it up to a stall? And I went through all of those things to find out. I wanted the characteristics of that particular airplane. And I think I got them in that length of time because we got back, and by that time, there was other people had come into the program, and I was able to carry on a halfway decent test. Now, my test was not as a test pilot for the factory would do. I was testing it as the user. That was what I wanted out of it. But on the other hand, I did do the Phase 5 flight test for the factory and the government because there was nobody to fly that airplane in thunderstorms and things like that. But they wanted to measure stresses and strains, and they took got an airplane all instrumented up. And I guess I flew the engineers riding around in the Bob Bay. I flew them around for, I don't know, probably 10 hours. Over a period of 4 or 5 days while they were measuring stuff with this airplane. But I got to like the airplane, and I was really happy with it. Now, you know, by this time, Boeing's back in production. They're building airplanes, they're coming out. People are being funneled into the thing, and they're moving off base because they had to start the 58th bomb wing and all that sort of thing. And I, as a spectator, was attached, well, not as a spectator, I was attached when they became official. I was attached to them because up to that time I didn't have anybody I reported to. And on the basis of that, I got to going, and I wound up testing those airplanes for close to 15 months. And by that time I had done a whole lot of things with the B-29 airplane. One of the most important for my purposes was I had helped conduct the tests of the airplane to survive a fighter attack. That was done at Alamogordo, New Mexico. They had at Alamogordo, they had 2 Japanese Zeros, they had German Messerschmitts, they had British Spitfires, they had all of our airplanes, fighters, so P-38, P-47. That was the total at that time. P-51 wasn't quite into its own yet. I don't remember P-51, but I do remember that on a day in this event, I went down, and the airplane that had been the test airplane had to have 2 engine changes. And Dr. Workman from the University of New Mexico, who held the contract for the test, he said, "Oh my God," he said, "I'm right here ready to write the last few words of the test, and I haven't got a B-29. I had flown there from Grand Island, Nebraska, in an airplane called a B-29, but it didn't have any armament in it either. It didn't have anything that it was supposed to have for the combat airplane. It was a flying machine. And I used that to get around all the places that I had to go. Now, who gave it to me, I don't know. But anyway, I arrived at some place, and they put me in that airplane to do certain things. When I got through with it, then I was ordered to go somewhere else. So I just took the airplane and went. And that's the way I arrived at Alamogordo with this airplane. So I told Dr. Workman, I said, I upgraded machine guns, but I said on my equipment, because there's none in it, but I got a flying machine out there. They called the B-29. He said, could you fly it back and forth at 25,000 feet on a east-west track? I said, yeah, that'd be easy, yeah. He said, that's all I need. The fighters have got gun cameras. I don't need the bomber to have it. So we did, I guess. We took off in due time. Took off. I'm flying along after a couple of hours, fat, dumb, and happy, and enjoying the ride, and watching these guys and their fighters come in and make passes and do acrobatics and all that kind of stuff, like they had a victory kill. And I thought, well, myself, that's strange, but one of them somebody called on the radio and said, tell him slow down, I can't catch him. That guy said, tell him slow down, my engines are overheating. I looked at my altimeter, instead of being at 25,000 feet, I was at 30. Because I'd had it on autopilot without an altitude hold, and it just drifted up. I wasn't paying attention. I'd go at the end of the course, I just turn the gauges and have it fly back. With that, I landed the airplane after the time had expired, and a man met me from the headquarters of the air base, and he said, we got a call from General Ent. You're to report to his office tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. Bring your B-4 bag with you because you're not going to go back to Alamogordo. Fine. Routine stuff, wartime. Next morning at 9 o'clock, I was at his office. I flew the airplane up, landed, I landed that night and spent the night at the BOQ. Next morning at 9, I was around to tell General Ent I was there. And I walked in to identify myself to the secretary. She said, well, I know Colonel Tibbets, he's expecting you, but he's busy right now. So she punched her squawk box and said, Colonel Tibbets is here. Voice cut back, says, tell him to wait a minute. Fine. I shrugged my shoulders, that wasn't unusual. And happened to be looking at the door entrance to his office, and out comes a lieutenant colonel wearing the insignia of the Corps of Engineers. He walks up to me, he said, I'm Jack Lansdale, I'd like to ask you some questions. Why would he ask me questions? I said, all right. And with that, he also motioned, he said, there's a cloakroom over there. He said, let's go over, we can close the door and talk ourselves out. Fine. So we got inside, and there was a kind of a shelf arrangement there underneath the window. And he used that to open his dossier, and he looks at it. He said, got a few questions to ask you. So he asked me some ordinary, mundane type questions. I confirmed the fact that was it. His assumptions and whatnot were correct, this, that, and the other. And finally he got down in the questioning department to say, have you ever been arrested? I said, sure. He said, what for? I said, well, my old man was good to me. I'm going to the University of Florida. Cincinnati. I said, when I got home, wasn't unusual. Get the car late at night or late in the afternoon, go to Miami Beach, spend the night in the evening, and come back into Miami when everything was quiet as could be. And I'd drive down either Flagler Street or Miami Avenue, and got arrested a couple of times by over speeding. He said, I don't mean that, anything more serious. So right then I knew the guy had something on me. He was testing me to tell whether I'd tell the truth or not. So I said, sure. He said, what? I said, well, one of these nights, or maybe in the early morning hours, I'm at Surfside, north of Miami Beach. I'm in the back seat of an automobile with a young woman in a compromising position. And he laughed, he clapped his hands, he said, that's all I want to know. And with that, he said, I'm Jack Lansdale. He said, I do the security for the Manhattan Project. That didn't mean anything to me. But we walked back inside. He said, let's go to General Ent's office. So we walked in the General's office, and he's preceded me. And he said, General Ent, we're satisfied with Paul Tibbets. And with that, I was introduced to Captain Parsons, a Navy captain, who actually rode with me on the trip. He was a naval gun expert. He was a part of the Manhattan District at that particular time. And Dr. Norman Ramsey, young man. And he said, I want to tell you about the Manhattan Project. So he gave me an outline about split. First off, he said, do you know anything about atoms? And I said, no. I said, I remember the atomic scales from college and whatnot, took physics. He said, that's enough. I said, fine. And he laid out in front of me, he talked about 45 minutes of where they were, what they had done, and what was going on in the development of an atomic bomb, etc. And with that, they turned the general in and they said, General, we've said all we need to say. And he said, fine. Well, after they left, he had me sit down again, and he said, Paul, he said, I got a call from General Arnold not too long in the past. He gave me the names of 3 officers. You were one of them. And the other one, he said, I think you know him, General Frank Armstrong, who was your boss in England. And I said, yes, sir, I know General Frank Armstrong quite well. He said, okay. Then we got another one, a very nice officer who was from General Arnold's office in Washington. And he asked me which of the 3 names would he pick for this special project, because he'd already told Ed what it was. And Ed said, I want Paul Tibbets. He said, tell him. And okay, so I got told. And he counseled me, he said, look, he said, you got to organize and train a unit to drop these weapons simultaneously on both Japan and in Europe. Yes, sir. He said, secrecy is the name of the deal. I've instructed you to use normal channels for anything that you need. Because he said, you're the boss. I can't tell you what to do. Nobody can tell you what to do. You're it. You have the total responsibility for doing all of this. I said, yes, sir. I was confident enough. I knew I could do it. I mean, at that time, I had so much confidence that you can't imagine. I'd been successful in everything I'd undertaken. To put an airplane together to carry a bomb, to get the people to fly them, maintain them, and all that sort of thing, I had no problem with them. Because, number one, I got a lot of good experience with my navigator and bombardier in North Africa. Those were the first 2 men I asked for. They knew other ones. They recommended to me when I said, we got a special project. I'm not telling you what it is, don't want you to even ask me, but if we are successful in what we're doing, we might, make this war a little bit shorter. And fine, nobody questioned anything.
Can I stop you for 1 second? Did you say at that time that they were also thinking about dropping one on Germany too?
Yes, sir. We had a war going on. Nobody signed a peace treaty in Europe yet. And maybe they weren't looking for it that quick. Or maybe they couldn't have been there. Ed wouldn't have said that to me. But yes, people don't realize it. I was told that what that did was compounded my problem. If it'd been half of that, it'd been just half as easy. But really, it wasn't. If I had to go for a split operation, I wanted a squadron worth of people and airplanes. That would be, because then I could break it up. Squadron is supposed to have 18 airplanes. And 9 airplanes and 9 airplanes, and divide the people up and so forth, and we could run. And that's the way I started out. And that proved to be the simplest thing I could think of. Ed says, fine. I didn't say what I was going to do. He said, I want you to remember, you've got an awful lot of responsibility, but you've got one hell of a lot of authority. He said, Paul, be careful how you use it, because if you come back a hero, that's one thing. But if this thing fails, he said, you might wind up in prison. Okay, so much money had been put into the Manhattan Project without anybody knowing what it was, where it came from, because Stimson was head of the Armed Service Committee, if I'm not wrong. And he and Roosevelt were good friends. And Roosevelt asked him to put this money through bills that were going to pass. And Stimson, I'm told, said, that's easy. And that's how they got all their money. Nobody knew what the millions of dollars were going for, but that was Grove's idea. And I think the man was right. While we're talking about Lester Groves, he treated me just as fine as anybody could. I respected him for what he said, but what he had done in the past. He knew how to organize people to get things done. He had an objective in mind. And in that perspective, I put myself in the same position. I knew what I was going to need. I didn't know how many of them, but I knew what I was going to need, and that's what I started out to build. And I will just bring it around now to all of this took place in 1944. And, so 43, 44. But by Christmas time of 44, I got the name from Washington as the 509th Composite Group. I was legally entitled to that. I having trouble, I got everything that I wanted except airplanes. Those airplanes being C-54s. I put in a requisition for 15 B-29s that went through just like a flash. And I got called one day on the telephone from a man by the name of Risen. He'd been my roommate at Kelly Field in the same class I was in. He said, Paul, I'm not asking you what you're doing, but he said, I know it's important. He said, would you like to have your airplanes are going to come from Martin, Omaha. And then he said, would you like to have fuel-injected engines? I said, I sure would, because carburation was one of the biggest problems with the engines at that time. I said, I sure would. And his name was Whitnell T. Rise. I said, sure would. He said, how would you like to have Curtiss reversible pitch propellers? I said, fine, because the airplane, once it got loaded to start down the runway, you couldn't stop it. Didn't have brake energy to stop it. You couldn't control it with the tail, so you had to go off of the runway and into the boondocks in flying that thing that way. He said, would you like to have fast-acting bomb bay doors? That was another thing. It took a minute or a minute and a half for the doors to open, and almost a minute and a half to close at high altitude. They had to keep them open, and that created more drag on the engines and made them get hotter, and that's what hurt the performance of the airplane. And I said, sure would. He said, okay, fine. I thought you'd like all that. He said, I got 40 sets of them going to Omaha right now, and you'll get them. Well, I did. I got them. I got my airplane stripped, because that had gone on requisition when I said I wanted the airplanes to be received with no armament in them except the tail guns. I'd learned that at Alamogordo with the fighter attack. They might be able to get high enough to, make a pass. If they ever made one pass, missed, they weren't going to get another pass because I'd be gone by that time. It was just that close of a margin. And anyway, that was the way we went to work. And General Ed had told me when I left his office, he said, you go by Wendover, Utah, and take a look at it. If you like that place, you can have it. He said, if you don't like that, go to forgotten where field is, South Dakota. And then he gave me one in Kansas. He said, if you like them, you can have them. If you don't like them, we'll hunt for one you will like. Well, when I cleared over the hills after leaving Colorado Springs, and I looked down at that Wendover, Utah, it was a garden. They had water there. They had all kinds of stuff there. They had green grass growing. They had nice painted buildings. It was really a nice place that had been used as a combat crew training center. And that's why it was in such good order. It had all of its offices were manned. Its shops were manned. Base shops of all kinds, transportation, airplane engine repair, etc. Airplane. It was a going organization. All I needed to do is to move into it. So when I didn't do it then, but when I flew from there over, I just was going back to Grand Island, Nebraska, because that's where I had been assigned for duty before I got to Alamogordo. I'd been assigned there because Frank Armstrong, my boss, he was the boss, and he's the one that had put the tab on me. And I went back, and Frank Armstrong says, I'm going to lose you. I said, yes, sir, I was told that. He said, well, you go ahead. And he said, we'll see you over the Pacific. And I said, yes, sir. Well, I thought I would be, but he was posted at Guam, and I was at Tinian, for the specific reason that Tinian had longer runways and a lot of different things, which I tickled to death. I was assigned to the 313th Bomb Wing. Now, that wing was commanded by Brigadier General Emma Davies. He was a nice guy, very nice. And he had his group commanders. With me, happened to be 5 group commanders. Normally, they only had 4 group commanders under a wing, but they had 5 in this case. And Jim Davies always had his staff, commanders, come up to his own lunch, wing headquarters, every day at noon, so that they could talk about what happened last night, what we're going to do tomorrow, what we're going to do tonight, or anything that went on. And that was a good liaison. They kept it going real good. And with that, I settled into the 314. See, nobody could touch me. Nobody knew what I was doing. Curiosity reigned supreme. And one day I'd been out flying, and I came back and landed. And when I got back to my headquarters office on Tinian there, my Quonset, why, the sergeant there said, General Davies called a while ago. He said he'd like for you to come up about 15 minutes early. He wants to talk to you. So I said, fine. I took my shower bath and got in the staff car and went on up and arrived at his office. And I went inside, and he looked at me and he said, I went out to look at one of your airplanes today. Yes, sir. He said, the guard challenged me. I said, yes, sir. He asked me if I had a green card. Anybody got near the airplane had to have a green card, mechanics and everybody, pilots, and co-pilots, and gunners, everything. They had to have it. And he said, the guard challenged me. And I said, yes, sir, he should have. And he said, I took my AGO card out, and he said, I told him who I was. He said, General Davies, I recognize you, but if you don't have a green card, you can't get on this airplane. And he said, I don't need one. I threw my AGO card at him and took one step, and he cocked his rifle and pointed it at me. He said, General, one more step and you're dead. Then he asked me, would he have shot me? I said, yes, sir, he would have, no doubt in my mind. He said, I thought so. It's the reason I came back here and called you. That ended the curiosities on everybody's part.